Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for 360 Feedback Best Practices to Fuel Success. I'm going to get everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll take care of a few housekeeping items and introductions. I'm Jessie Bieringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Please feel free to ask questions using the chat function throughout the presentation. We'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end in a Q&A session. Joining me to discuss 360 Feedback Best Practice is 3D Group President Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is the founder of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose is an author and co-editor of the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. He's also a fellow of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. In addition to designing custom 360 feedback systems for clients, Dr. Rose personally coaches leaders in focused post-360 feedback sessions. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first-line supervisor. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, CEO World, and HR.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dale, to get us started.
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks for everyone joining today. Excited to talk about my favorite subject, 360 feedback, and share with you some ideas around what some best practices are. I'll do some early kind of level setting in terms of 360 feedback, some of the research findings, a little bit of background on kind of where we see the process, working best and how to think about kind of the different phases of the process. And then I'm going to identify a half a dozen kind of key levers I think you want to think about anytime you're designing a feedback process or revising a process. And then I will make sure to leave time for questions. This sort of one-way format is great to get information out, but I find the questions can be most valuable. So I encourage you to put those in the chat as we go, and Jesse will pull them together, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end and get a little bit more back and forth. So I like to kind of start with the business case. So, at the end of the day, feedback is an investment. It's an investment in many ways for certainly on behalf of the company, but it's we like to think about feedback as an investment that raters make in providing opportunities for growth to leaders. So they're investing in those leaders. But let's think about the business case. Why would a business, invest in a process like this? Often these are questions that come to us in the business where your leaders are asking, why would we do this versus say something else? So there was a study done a little bit now ago published in the Journal of Applied Psychology where Kim et al. Dug into 253 companies and really in depth, some meta-analysis looking at what are the impacts of companies that do and don't use 360 feedback. And the bottom line, a lot of details in a meta-analysis, certainly anything published in Journal of Applied Psychology has got some details in it. But it really boiled down to the conclusion that what they found was companies that used 360 feedback had found a very positive impact on workforce productivity. So, at a global level, we find there is business value in this, that using this tool will have a positive impact on the business and specifically on the bottom line. We've also done our own study where we looked at, we just did a study in a retail environment where we looked at the store manager in those retail settings at 65 store managers and just sort of split them down the middle in terms of the scores, high scores and low scores, to see was there any difference in terms of annual sales revenue. These are sort of big box retailer here. Always kind of blows my mind to think you've got a $60 million business in one of those big box retailers. And these annual revenues were controlled for some local factors, time in, these were not like brand new stores, for example, that kind of thing. We found that those high scores really are where the revenues are showing up. Almost a $5 million a year difference in terms of revenue when you look at what those high scoring retail managers are doing. So, we're seeing kind of at the micro level, store level, but also at that larger level that 360s do have a positive impact on the bottom line for companies. We also have some of our own broader data. So we've done a study now. I think we're in our eighth edition with a large number of companies, asking them what do you currently do in your 360 feedback process. So this is the only benchmarking study of its kind that also provides over 20 years of data. So you can really see in this report, what are the trends over time. And one of the things that we asked in our most recent study was, we asked, what are the business metrics that you see having an impact? And we found, 4 out of 5 companies felt that leaders were using the tools to make the 360 tools to make better decisions. And then certainly they're seeing a benefit in terms of increasing retention for those high potentials. And high potentials are a particularly valuable audience for 360s, because we know as high potentials really, really want feedback. They absolutely thrive on a high feedback environment. And so the opposite is true too. If they're not getting feedback, aren't being encouraged to grow, aren't being encouraged to use that feedback to improve, they're just not going to stick around, to be perfectly frank. So again, not surprising from our standpoint, but we're seeing that there are many areas in which 360s do have a positive impact on that bottom line. If you're interested in a copy of this report, we can certainly get you one. You can actually get one on our website, just by electronically, just by asking and telling us where to send. Lots of good data points in this study that will be helpful, and I'll cite a few more of these data points as we go as well. So one thing I like to just start off with, so we know 360 feedback has a positive impact on the bottom line in a bunch of different areas. But when we talk to companies about what 360 feedback is, interestingly, we hear lots of different versions of it. And there's kind of at the basic level, you could ask yourself, well, why are we doing 360 feedback? What is it? What is it that we're getting that's different? Well, if you think about typical workplace feedback, right, your sort of non 360 environment, you're going to have one manager, and you want to get lucky. If these are the 4 choices you've got, you want to get lucky, because generally in typical workplace feedback, you're really only getting feedback from your manager. That's kind of where 90+% of your feedback and direction is coming from. And so it's a little bit of a lottery about who is your manager at this point in time. And I think each of you can probably look back and think about managers that were better or worse for you in terms of the way they supported your development, supported your growth, helped you see where you could grow or not. So it's not that a manager can't be a valuable resource. Absolutely it can. But if we expand the lens a little bit and recognize that these folks may only see one slice of you and not the full picture, that's where 360 feedback comes in. So the way we conceptualize 360 feedback is multiple sources: peers, direct reports, your supervisor, others, could be anything, could be internal business partners, could be customers. Define that how you like. But the idea is that this feedback recipient has an opportunity to understand the perspectives of these different groups. And there's a real, we actually had a question from a client the other day that was asking about, well, how do you deal with, biases and inconsistencies? And what I would say is that inconsistencies are exactly what we're trying to surface. So it could be that the peer perspective is radically different than the direct report perspective, and both of those views are valuable. So the peers may think this person's an absolute superstar. The other group may have a little bit more of a mixed view, right? If you just kind of were to throw a number on their perspective and make a global rating, you can see that the peer group here seems pretty happy. The others a little bit more mixed. So understanding, I'm treating my peers this way, but this other group, say these internal business partners, I'm treating very differently on this behavior or that behavior. And then we also look at within group differences, right? So let's focus on that other group down there, the guy in the lower left. Obviously, it's a very different point of view than the person directly above him. So while certainly in a 360, we're not identifying who said what, you don't want to know, Bob or Jane or whoever, and what they specifically said, but you do want to understand oh, there are differences in this other group in the way people are receiving me, and what can I learn from that in order to be more effective interacting with those individuals. So that's the basic lens. Now, I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit here around this notion around, and I've written about this notion about stakeholder interviews. So sometimes people will talk about 360 interviews. As we've defined it, and when I say we, my colleagues and I who've published on this extensively, 360 feedback is definitely not an interview. Stakeholder interviews are really valuable, but there are some critical pieces that are missing from a stakeholder interview that you do get when you use 360 feedback in the way we conceptualize it. So the way we conceptualize it is really kind of three core elements. First off, it's a quantitative survey. Now, there may be qualitative questions in that survey, but it's a quantitative survey so that you're able to indicate in very clear terms that allow comparisons between these sources, numeric ratings. Okay. The other piece is it's that survey contains relevant workplace behavior. So a lot of times in interviews, you're going to get things that may be kind of off book or may not be directly lined up with, say, the organizational strategy or what's needed from leaders in that organization. And those interviews often don't cover the full spectrum of leadership competencies, right? So the survey tool allows you to cover that full range. It also allows you to compare apples to apples so that multiple feedback sources becomes critical, right? Sometimes interviews might be only, say, direct reports or sort of 2 or 3 direct reports plus the manager plus a peer. Well, you don't have the full census from those different rater groups to be able to make those comparisons. So we really want to differentiate 360 feedback as being grounded in these three components. And again, no disrespect to the folks out there using stakeholder interviews. I think they're really valuable, but they are different, and you get something quite different in terms of the data that you pull. So what does it look like really exactly specifically? When you think about the survey itself, it's going to contain a question like this, one of my all-time favorites. How effective is this individual at the following behaviors? There's going to be more than one. We're just using one as an example. Listens to others attentively, right? Here's an example where you're going to get a rating scale. You always want to have a don't know, not applicable in there because sometimes people don't have an opportunity to observe. In this case, whether I'm listened to or not, you would assume pretty much everybody's had an opportunity to observe that. But you're going to give a quantitative rating scale with an opportunity to opt out if you haven't had an opportunity to observe. And then you're going to get an average score on that behavior from each of the rater groups. So you can see here the results. The self feels like he's doing pretty well. Manager feels like he's doing well. It's a strength. Peers, again, strengths, if not even exceptional. But direct reports, a much lower score. So again, you can see here very quickly I can identify group differences and recognize that listening is an issue with direct reports. This person's paying attention to and listening to others, or at least they feel listened to. But the direct reports, there may be an issue, and that may be worth exploring. So this is the way in which the quantitative survey based on clear, relevant behaviors that allow you to create comparisons can help you quickly zero in on a behavior that a leader may need to consider from a development standpoint. So who uses 360 feedback? Again, this is where we'll bring in our data from our benchmarking study. This is just sort of a generic framework to think about different levels, say sort of executive, mid-manager, and individual contributor. What we find is that about half the companies use it at that executive level. Another half use it at kind of this manager, director sort of level, and then much less frequently for individual contributors. And of course, these add up to more than 100 because people use it for more than one usage. So I think generally it's an investment that's made more at the more senior level of the organization. And one of the interesting factors around this is at higher levels, it becomes more important that you exhibit some of these behaviors, and it becomes more difficult to get feedback about it, right? So listening effectively is very important. I mean, it's important for everybody on this map, But in particular, leaders that don't listen, it can be a real problem in terms of their ability to be effective in the role. So that's kind of who uses it. Um, Another thing to recognize is that at the core of 360 is a very baseline concept around self-awareness, right? So fundamentally, we walk around in the world with a view of ourselves, and it's very difficult to get reflected on how do other people receive me. Can't tell you how many leaders I've talked to, and that particular item is my favorite for a reason, where they think, well, I'm great at listening. What are you talking about? Well, they're focusing on different people, different rater groups, or their own experience. They think they're listening well. But the issue here is, how do other people see it? Do other people see the same thing? And what we find is leaders are often quite surprised. They'll, around what their behaviors are and how those behaviors are received by others. So let me give you kind of a demonstration here. We've got a pretty typical piece of fruit here, familiar to most, an apple. What I want to do is ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is most delicious apple I've ever seen, and 1 is I wouldn't eat that if you put my arm behind my back. How would you rate this apple? So just think about it for a minute, or a second. Give it a number, 1 through 10, and then let me give you some additional data. So I look at this apple, and I probably give it an 8, maybe a 9. Looks pretty good. Looks pretty crisp. So right up there, positive, solid. But the key here is that I'm only looking at it from one perspective when I come up to that rating. And if I'd actually had a multi-view perspective, I might actually recognize that the backside of this apple maybe changes my rating. So part of the issue here is that with leaders, they may be seeing only the shiny side of it and not recognizing the piece that's just unseen. And 360 feedback helps bring forth the unseen. Now, the downside in my example here is that it assumes that the thing that's unseen is something horrible and yucky that you don't want to eat. And that's not necessarily true. Of course, your apple could be this way on the backside as well. What's interesting is, in this case, if the leader is looking at it and going, "Oh, I'm doing great," and then they catch this, that's what we would call a blind spot. They're unaware that, oh, actually, there's another view, there's another perspective. At the same time, some leaders will think that they see it this way. Okay, they'll think that they're really struggling, things aren't going well, people don't have any confidence in me, they doubt me constantly, and then the ratings may show them this, which we would refer to as an unexpected strength. So just recognizing that kind of self-awareness can be very, very valuable for a leader. So this can make a leader aware that they have things to improve, or maybe that they are doing great and they just didn't realize it. The challenge is that letting them know that awareness, self-awareness, isn't always enough. So if we take a look at this leader, undoubtedly this leader is aware that they are perhaps bottlenecking things, but yet obviously they have continued to exhibit the behavior that is, I like to think about this as like the bottleneck, right? Like I am not, I have to do it all. I can't leverage other people. To me, this is a big, this image speaks delegate, delegate, delegate. So, in theory, this person's aware, though. It'd be very hard for them to miss it. The key is they have to accept that feedback, right? So if you or a leader is in a situation where they actually do recognize that something they're doing is not as effective as they'd like it to be, they have to accept it. So how do the 360 is going to get someone to be aware of, they're going to see the apple, right? But you also have to think about acceptance, and because awareness won't just do it. So we use a change model that starts with awareness, right? So the first bit is awareness, and you have to let people know what others see in them, and then you move to an action planning phase where it's like, okay, what are we going to do about it? And then of course that's ultimately what will lead to change. But you'll notice that there are a couple of key elements missing here in these blank spots. So the key drivers between awareness and action planning, as I said, was acceptance. So you also in your process need to think through what am I doing to get leaders to accept their feedback? I've done the process, right? I've distributed the surveys, it's all the right content. But what am I doing to help them accept the feedback? Then make a plan. And then, even then, making the plan isn't always enough. Every January, I make a plan, and by February, I may or may not be on the plan. Now, if I have an accountability partner or some other accountability mechanism, I'm way more likely to change that behavior. So, one of the pieces that we see missing quite frequently in a design is people will often focus on items and content, rating scales, and frequency, and all that stuff to get awareness, but they'll overlook the acceptance and the accountability piece. So, one best practice to think about is to really ask yourself, what are we doing to help leaders actually accept their feedback, and how are we helping them be accountable, which is very different than requiring them to be accountable, but we could get into that. All right, so what I'm getting into now is kind of design and how you go about developing a process to actually move leaders through this process and get to the change you want. So when you think about designing a process, there are lots of questions, right? Many, many, many questions come up. The first one is who that person over there needs feedback. Rarely, by the way, is it, oh, I need feedback, but it does happen. So as soon as you ask that question and then you start trying to design the process, all of a sudden other questions just start popping up. It gets quite complicated quite quickly. And what I would say is you want to try to address these questions up front rather than find out in the middle. So, for example, you don't want to go through the entire process and then think, well, who should get a copy of the report? That should be clear absolutely from the outset. Who owns the report? Does HR get a copy of this? Does the individual own it themselves? Is their manager going to give it? These are things you got to think about ahead of time. We've written about, and there's a kind of a framework to think about. If your real goal when you're designing a process like this is behavior change, there are some essential design features and a couple essential frameworks that you can answer those questions within. Okay, so the first is relevant content, right? You need to have content that is relevant to your environment. Certainly, an off-the-shelf tool can be very valuable. We have them, we use them all the time. General leadership behaviors. But if you can, customizing to your environment, even if it's just the language, the tone, if you've got your own competency model, that's ideal. But you want to make sure they're really clear and actionable. Notice the item I had, listens to others attentively. So this might be part of a broader strategic focus on collaboration. Very clear, very behavioral, very actionable. If you don't have relevant content, it won't work. I actually have seen a 360 commercially available 360 tool, worst one I've ever seen, that had a question on it that perfectly illustrates this point. One of the questions is, if Dale was a dog, what breed of dog would he be? And there's a list of 20 breeds. Not relevant, not motivating me to change. I might understand it or I might not. Definitely not accepting that as useful for my development. Listens to others attentively, 100% I'm going to pay attention to that. The other dimension is the credibility around the data, right? So if you're asking the right questions, that's a great first start. But let's say you ask the questions of the wrong people. We will often get, in fact, just yesterday I was working with a leader who insisted that his scores were low because it was the wrong people that were selected. I did point out that he had selected them, but that's a story for another day. So making sure the right people are providing data so it's credible. I'm not really going to accept the feedback if it's from the wrong people or it's the wrong items. And then the other piece is anonymity, right? I will trust these data if I know people were honest. The best way to get people to be honest is to provide them, anonymity, or if you want to get technical, confidentiality, because it's not truly anonymous. Your feedback provider technically knows who said what. But that anonymity is what gives people, in a sense, permission to really say, hey, look, my manager isn't listening to me and it's very frustrating. in a hope that they'll change. And then the third leg of the stool, if you will, is really around accountability. So you want to build in some accountability mechanisms where people are paying attention to this person's behavior and focus on supporting them. Feedback coach can do that. The executive coach, sometimes a coach will be used in that context. We really recommend manager involvement, right? So the person's manager themselves should be aware, not necessarily of every single item in the survey and all the comments and all the details, but what are the key takeaways? What are the things this report tells the leader they need to work on and focus on, and then hold them accountable for actually addressing that over time. So we recommend involving the manager wherever possible. Okay, so these are kind of some basic parameters around how to think about 360 feedback, what the basic design features are that you're going to want to think about, and how to frame your design thinking generally about a change model and what do we know is going to actually move leaders forward. Let me dive into my 6 top items for consideration for your best practices and things you ought to think about and incorporate into your process. Again, whether you're starting at the beginning or you're refreshing what you're doing now, or you're struggling with what you're doing now and want to try to make a difference, these 6 I think will put you in good stead. So the first is to be clear about purpose. Why are you doing this? What do you hope to gain? What is the value of this? And to be clear to really everyone involved. These are the data across time since we've been asking this question in our benchmark study. And clearly, if you look through this list, sort of the top chunk of these are around development, and it all starts to sort of drop off. So the top 2 are like, yeah, obviously 3/4 or more saying development is the purpose. And so I would argue that with any 360, development should be a part of the purpose, but you can use it also for these talent development issues as well. Certainly succession planning is a relatively common one. Clearly, direct paid increases, not necessarily a great choice. This is not, you're likely to get gamesmanship. If people know that my feedback is confidential and I'm doing this to help this person improve, they're much more willing to make that investment that I talked about earlier. But generally speaking, it's kind of development and then development plus, right? So many of the organizations we work with and we interviewed for this are using it for development, but they're also using it to link it to succession planning. They also are using it to identify hypos. So there are multiple ways you can integrate 360s into your talent platform without giving up the need for using it for development. One of the big opportunities we see missed often is the idea to recognize the value of 360s for the big picture. A lot of times people think about 360s solely as an individual leader development tool. But in truth, and as our book talks about, the Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback, if you use it in a census way, if you use it across your organization, you can really use 360s to drive and support organizational strategy. So there are ways to lever it that are quite a bit beyond there. The other thing that we see is this need to communicate. A lot of times, as I mentioned, folks will work on building the machine of it and how do we collect and report feedback, but they don't do the communication up front about why we're doing it, what the purpose is, why somebody would want to get it. A really good communication plan can go a long way. So we recommend spending a fair amount of time communicating purpose, communicating the rules of engagement, communicating the goals. So anyone participating, consider participating, or even providing feedback understands what that bigger picture is. And you sure you're going to see individual change, but are you also thinking about organizational change? So most importantly, make sure that the messaging is right about that purpose, and then recognize that there are opportunities to go beyond just that individual development. Another key lever, and one could argue this might be the most important lever, is to think about senior leadership. So what kind of support do you have within the organization for your 360 process? Now, as I've said in sessions before, everybody wants senior leadership support for their program, right? If you're doing a greening of the buildings project, you want your CEO to go, hey, we really need green buildings and energy efficiency. of course. In 360 feedback, it's a little bit different, right? At the top of the organization, they are more focused than most on how are our leaders developing, growing, how effective are they, what does our bench strength look like? Because at the end of the day, your leaders are what's going to drive your strategy and make an organization successful or not. So in our benchmarking study, we ask, well, how much senior level support do you have? What do people typically get? We are heartened to see that at the very top of the organization, even at the CEO level, 4 out of 10 CEOs support a 360, and then not that surprising that the CHRO and the chief learning officer are going to support it pretty strongly. Um, but this, leveraging the support that you've got at the top to provide messaging and to be able to walk into any of their offices and say, hey, this is a tool for you as the CEO to be able to message what you expect of leaders throughout the organization. Most CEOs would like to be able to drive leader behavior, and somehow doing that video that shows up on screens or a quick webinar is not necessarily going to move the needle. But messaging to people what the individual behaviors are that CEO expects of leaders, then asking them to get data and take action on it, that's going to make a big difference. So I think 360 is uniquely situated to be able to really drive forward an agenda for a senior leadership team, and I highly recommend leveraging it in that way. I talked before about the importance of content, right? So survey content is super important. I mean, again, off-the-shelf tools can be really good at the individual level. You can use them at the group level, but if you're using 360s across the organization, you've got a real opportunity. And I'll have to own this. There is a trade-off, right? If you're running a 360 for 4 people in your organization, you're not going to customize content. If you're running it for all your leaders, you probably do want to customize content. So the recognition here is that when you get the right content, when you're using a survey that has items within a competency model that is relevant to the culture and the strategy, you can really move the dial across the organization. Because again, 360 can be this lever to identify the behavior that the senior leadership expects of their leaders, and then a tool to help them change that behavior. So I'll give you an example from a case study that I did a while ago. I actually published a chapter on this. So this company that I was working with started early on in the process wanting innovation and changes to happen in the organization. They wanted people to be innovating and looking for ways to improve, their current processes and operations. So they had an item in their survey that was seeks opportunities for process improvements. So, as a leader, I'm like, I should be looking for process improvements. Who knew? Well, there it is. CEO put this in here, so probably I should. So for the first couple of years, we used this item, seeks opportunities for process improvement, and that started to come along, and the CEO started to see those changes happening, and there was a shift where people were, how can I incrementally improve? But he wanted to push it a little further, and so he changed that item to be makes transformational changes to benefit the business, right? So you can see in this way, he was really using the item content to message out and create conversations about how could I make process improvements. And then once we kind of got that stagnant, if you will, it became the new norm. He wanted to push further, and now people are giving feedback on, and then discussing afterwards, what can I do to make transformational changes to benefit the business? But a good example, I think, of how you can really lever content to drive culture and drive changes across the organization that fit your strategy. So how do you go about customizing content? For the most part, 3/4 of companies we talk to do customize their content. As I mentioned, it's going to vary a lot for a lot of different reasons, right? If you've got small volume, it's probably not going to be cost justified. Big enough volume, at a certain point, those costs amortize, and it's absolutely worth customizing that tool. Still, off the shelf, has its place. When we unpack even a little further under that custom, well, how do I go about customizing, right? Many companies will ask. Well, a lot of different ways. So, on the one hand, they can just sort of outsource it, have a consultant come in and do all the customization, usually with some input from senior leaders, approvals, that kind of thing. Or they can work just internally, or it can be a blend. So a lot of different ways to go about customizing. I would say CEOs are the worst item writers. So if your CEO is interested in participating, or even senior leaders in getting that content just right for the company, love that. That's fantastic. You're probably going to want an external who can come in and try to push that person to be a little bit more rigorous in the way they write items, or the items that you end up with, because poorly written items become very confusing to both raters and then also to the people receiving feedback. And CEOs just don't think in the way that a clear, tight item works. That listening to others attentively will become like, a massive run-on sentence that will elaborate on why it's important and all these things, and from a measurement standpoint, not work particularly well. So also staying with content is the question of length, right? So how long of a survey? So back in the day, and I won't even say when that day was, but let's say it was a while ago, 360s have been around for a long time. We saw surveys that were, I mean, goodness, they were 120, 130 items long. They took forever to complete. Even now, there's some commercial instruments that take 30 or 40 minutes to complete. What we're seeing in the data, and our own experience supports this as well, is really 70 questions is about your top. You can get a little over that if you need. But if you're writing items like listens to others attentively, and it's a clear 5-point rating scale, you can complete a 70 item survey with that general, scope in 4 or 5 minutes. It's really not that hard. Now, when you get to the open-ended questions, which we tend to see there are generally 2 or 3 open-ended questions at the end of a survey, that can take a long time. We have one client where each rater literally writes a full single-spaced page. I mean, they can get 20 pages of text. It's extremely rare. This particular client, if you knew who they were, you'd get why. But the open-ended comments can take a long time, but that's totally discretionary. People can decide to spend time on it or not. A short survey, I would say 40 is probably about the minimum that I would use, depending on the number of competencies, to get reliable and valid data. When you start getting into the 1 to 20 range, individual items are just not enough for reliability when you're trying to look across the company, or if you're trying to make succession or hypo kind of decision making and that kind of thing. You really do run into some troubles. And even from a development standpoint, it's going to come across as a little thin. And you've already got a rater in there. You've done all the work. Do you want to give them a survey that takes 2 minutes or 4 minutes? It seems like the extra 20 items is probably worth it to get it up there. So we generally recommend 40 to 70 questions as a sweet spot. And on average, we find 44. So too much over 70, it's going to be abuse. Too much under, say, 30, it's just going to not have the impact you're looking for. Don't overlook the importance of anonymity. 3/4 of companies recognize this is absolutely essential for the process. And so when you look at what are we doing to assure our raters of anonymity and confidentiality, and what are we doing to assure leaders receiving feedback that the data is honest because of the anonymity, and then also what are we doing to help those leaders sort of not focus on the who said what, because that's not really as relevant as trying to understand those trends and differences between groups. So a couple different mechanisms for that. The first and most important, perhaps most common, has to do with the number of raters that you include in a data set before you report them. So if you think back to that graph with the supervisor, the direct reports, the peers, the others, you're not going to report data if you have unless you have at least 3, say, direct reports in the data set to report. Because if there's only 2, and obviously if there's only 1, there's really very little anonymity. But once you get 3 in there, it's real hard to kind of figure out who said what. I would say, we've seen this trend vary quite a bit across time. I would say 3 raters is kind of the standard, right? It's pretty clearly established as that is the sort of typical minimum. You can ratchet that up. We've got obviously some companies do as many as 6 as the minimum. 6 as a minimum really limits the number of people you can get feedback to. We more often find people asking for, could we decrease it to 2 so we can get more people feedback? And we generally will say it's not, unfortunately, it's not going to work. You're not going to get the feedback you're looking for because it won't be as anonymous as you'd like. So make sure that and then I think it's also important that you message really clearly what, that there is anonymity and why and how you do that. So we always put a piece in there saying a minimum of 3 is required to report data so people understand there's confidentiality. And then the last bit I would say from a best practice standpoint is think about coaching. So it's the image here, I have to thank Jesse. It's not just icing on the cake, it's the cake, right? So, again, 4 out of 5 companies saying feedback, a coaching debrief is available. Now, you got to be careful here because it's not as though you can make, and also to differentiate, before I do that, feedback coaching is just a 1 hour session with a leader to help them make sense of what they can do with the feedback. It should never be an explanation of the report. The report should be clear. If you need to pay a coach to explain the report, you need a new report. But a coach coming in and saying, okay, what do you think of your feedback? Let's talk about what's going on in your environment and what you might be able to do to address the feedback. Let's find what those key 3 top priorities are and then get you a plan on how to do that. You can do that in an hour if you've got a good enough coach doing it. So I think this notion of supporting, and particularly at the senior leadership level, we see this much, much more often. If you're running a process with all the managers in your company, it may be cost prohibitive. So there's a balancing act there. But generally, at least at the senior level, the ROI is so high on feedback coaching that it really makes quite a bit of difference. And again, if you think back to our model, without feedback coaching, what are you really doing to help assure acceptance? I mean, acceptance is probably the number one thing coaches start trying to work on, is making sure the person accepts the feedback, not just understands it intellectually, but accepts it as something they need to work on, and then helps give them some accountability mechanisms for how they're going to go ahead and make that change. And again, 80% saying that one-on-one feedback is essential to the process. So one way or another, you want to be thinking about how are we incorporating the feedback coaching, and you can do it internally. There are ways to do that, but I highly recommend that feedback coaching. Leaders time and time again talk about how much more value they got just because they had someone working with them on the data. All right, so those are my top 6. I'll go through them real quick again. You want to be clear about purpose. Don't get confused at the end. That should drive a lot of your decisions. Leverage your senior leadership support. Super important. Being careful about how they write items. Recognizing there's a value to the content for the organization. So looking at group level data and working with senior leaders on what you're seeing there and what you'd like to see. Keep the survey short and focused enough that people can fill it out. It's not overwhelming on the report. Recognize the importance of anonymity and hold it dear. Make sure you're communicating this clearly to everybody, the importance of that. And then consider how can we include coaching in the process. Couple of more data points on the 360 and where people see it going. What we see is people really value the process. We talked about the senior level support. When we ask them, do you see doing more of this or the same? For the most part, people, it's the same or more, not less. And they see their budgets being the same or higher. So there seems to be a pretty strong tailwind around the value that 360 feedback brings. And I think if you can apply some of these best practices, you're going to make it more valuable, frankly. It wouldn't be a slide in 2020, a slideshow in 2026 if I didn't talk about AI. So I'm going to slide it in here at the end. Many people are asking about this, not surprisingly. When we collected these data, I think ChatGPT was still under 100 million users, and I'm sure they're over a billion now. So it was a little bit in the earlier days, and as we know, AI is moving very, very quickly. If you think you know something about AI now, wait 2 months, it'll be totally different. So we asked, how are you using AI in your feedback process? Maybe you've got some ideas now and you're thinking about it. What we found is that really very few people at that point in time were using it. This is growing, but it's interesting. And I'll be doing a talk in September specifically on the ways that AI can be used and is used. It turns out it is actually fairly limited. It's not zero. There are some very valuable ways AI can be integrated, but there's some limits and some elements that really aren't conducive to AI. So it's kind of right sizing. When we ask those 5%, well, what are you doing? And again, keep in mind this was very much early days. I mean, we're still in early days, but early in the process, two real things came about. One was analyzing group results. Certainly, we know this. I mean, engagement survey people are thrilled because finally they can make sense of comments. So same kind of idea. You can take large swaths of data if you're using this across your organization and summarize them and try to understand what's going on across the leadership group and in your pipeline. And then certainly supporting survey development. You can ask AI to get you survey items. I will say this, it's very much still to this day, it's very much a human in the loop process. I would never take an AI generated question whole cloth. Always it's going to require reframing, tightening, etc. But there's nothing wrong with sort of starting and or getting ideas, maybe a little bit of wordsmithing through the tool. So supporting survey development, but you're not going to just have it spin one up and there it is. So those are my ideas. Those are my thoughts. Those are the best practices we see them. If you're interested in reading more, we actually our book on strategic 360 feedback is quite in depth. I recommend it highly. We actually have a discount code. If you ping us, we can get it for you. But this book's. I actually was at a conference earlier this year where one of the presenters at a session I was attending referred to it as the Bible of 360 feedback. That might be a little bit of high praise, but I was pretty thrilled to hear it. So, all right, with that, I have left time for questions. So I'm going to leave some space here and see if anybody had any along the way. Jesse, fire away.
Okay, so feel free to put them in the chat if you haven't already. One of the questions we have is around approach to introducing the process to executives. I guess if it doesn't already start with the executive, how would you recommend involving executives, given that that support is so important?
Yeah, so this goes back to purpose, right? So you just want to be clear about purpose. So as an example, what you don't want to do, you don't want to go and say, "Hey," to your executive team, "Hey, the CFO is kind of a jerk and we need to get him some feedback, so we're going to make you all do it." Of course, nobody would say that, but sometimes that message comes through, and I don't mean to pick on CFOs, but it's not necessarily the CFO. But so the purpose it needs to be clear up front, and so I would just come in with a clear purpose that is not individually targeted and more why we're doing this across the board. Again, generally, I would find out who at the very top is supportive of the idea, so you get some allies. But just be clear on purpose. You want to come in, and generally, it's going to be around. We're trying to keep people focused, make sure on improving, elevating their leadership, give employees a voice. Often we see engagement surveys will point to the need for leaders to listen more to their people, and so that can be kind of a follow-on action to say, hey, look at the data points we're hearing from people. They feel they don't have a voice or that kind of thing, and so for that reason we're going to step into this. Also have your senior leadership introduce it. In the best case scenario, your CEO is introducing why we're doing this and why it's important. CHRO can do it as well, but I would try to use their voice and support them in doing that.
Okay, another one is what are some common mistakes that you see organizations make when rolling out a 360 feedback process?
Well, I just gave an example of one. Like picking on one person is common. Like picking on, giving somebody a feedback process because it's their last ditch hope of keeping the person. Like that's throwing good money after bad. Sometimes maybe it works, but generally there are other ways that are going to be better. Let's see, other mistakes that people make. Not being clear up front about who gets what, right? So sometimes we'll be in situations where an HR person will call and say, hey, we need a copy of so and so's report. And it wasn't made clear to everybody that actually only that person gets to see a copy of the report. And that was the decision made up on top. And then that starts creating kind of resentment and confusion that should fit with the why, right? So if it's like, no, this person owns their own report, HR doesn't get to see it if those are the decisions you're making because it's for development and it's, they're accountable not for their results, they're accountable for what they do with the results and how they respond. Those are the kinds of things that can maybe help make it a little bit more clear. Let's see, we've seen a couple companies try to do 360s internally on their own. It's incredibly laborious. Even large companies trying to do so. If you're doing it in a smaller company, mid-sized company, spreadsheets, survey monkey, like it just use a professional. It's a complex process and they've got it down. The other reason to use professional that we see go awry sometimes, and we've seen talk to a couple of companies where they're trying to develop it internally, like their own software and all that. The reality is that there's no anonymity, there's no confidentiality of any kind. The IT department can see all those data. If the CEO wants to see exactly who wrote a comment about them or about any one of their leaders, they absolutely are going to get the content if it's run internally, and that can absolutely deteriorate the perception internally of that process being truly anonymous. At which point, people stop giving honest feedback. At which point, you're really just doing an exercise with very little value. So we feel pretty strongly that having an outside vendor that will, like, contractually is not going to give you the who said what actually increases value to the program. Um, oh, and then the other big one that comes to mind is what we call the desk drop. Just pushing people reports and saying, here you go, develop. You need to think support. You need to think, how am I going to get them to acceptance? How am I going to get them to accountability? What are we doing to support them in planning? That kind of stuff. So just my friend Dave Bracken has this great phrase, which is like, feedback without support is abuse. So yeah, make sure you're supporting them in creating change, because that's the point. It's not just to get them a report.
Let's see. What role should HR or team leads play in the process? How do you see the role of HR?
So I can talk to HR. Team leads starts to get me to questions about the org structure and what role the team lead has. What does a team lead mean? All that. And I could get into that on a separate conversation. But HR typically should play the role in a sense of, I would think about it as like setting up the guardrails. So being, clear about, the data governance, who gets what. Um, Guiding some of the development of questions and purpose, but importantly also communicating that purpose, right? And making sure to, like, sometimes saying no, like, no, they'll find themselves in a situation where someone's saying, oh, this person just doesn't get it. We keep trying to tell them that they're all keep picking on the item listens. They're not listening to others. They're not collaborating. What are we going to do? Let's just give them a 360. And that's a moment for HR to say, hey, you're we're right at the cusp of maybe letting this person go. This isn't the time to give them a 360. The time to give them a 360 is when they're really trying to move up to that next level, or they're succeeding, they're doing fine, but you want to, elevate the game for them. And so I think sometimes it's about HR sort of saying no to shape the purpose of the process. Of course, there's also a fair amount of yes in there, but I think HR can be messaging what the purpose is, and holding those standards is pretty key. Um, yeah, first thoughts.
Okay, let's see. We have time for one more. This is sort of a loaded question. How can we ensure that the 360 process is used for development versus performance assessment?
Uh, be clear that it's not being used for that, right? That you're not using. I mean, I wouldn't, depending on the organization. Many organizations use it really well for performance assessment as well, or talent decision making in the talent management process. I think that's very much an option and can be done if it's communicated and set up correctly. But if your decision is to really just use it for development, then you just have to be very disciplined about who gets what reports, very clear about your rule sets, very clear about, um, again, HR doesn't see a copy, manager doesn't see a copy, but here's how people are being held accountable for change. They need to go to their manager and communicate their three goals that they learned in their 360, that sort of thing. Uh, I think that accountability is very important for development. Sometimes companies think, oh, it's for development, so we'll just give it to them. CCL for a long time, this was their mantra of like, they own the report, they can do what they want with it, it's theirs to use or not. They're not on that anymore. They've actually shifted their dialogue. John Fleener, a friend of mine, has kind of given me some insight that they've recognized that there's a yes and in there. But if you're going to be on development, just be really clear about how and why. And then it's even more important to think about the support on that back end. So feedback coaching, I mean, there's just few things that are going to make that development sink in more. And if you want to build in accountability, you can do that feedback coaching followed by a session with the person's manager to say, okay, let's make sure the manager's aware of what the issues are that emerged and help that manager help that leader develop. So just think, I think the main thing is just to be being clear up front, messaging, et cetera, but then also building in processes for support. And I would say the biggest one is the feedback coach is going to make the biggest difference.
Okay, I just got one more.
Great.
How do you see the role of continuous feedback apps?
Ah, so I wrote a chapter on this in my book. Continuous feedback apps don't work. That's the bottom line. I hate to say it, but the data we've seen is that early adopters will pick it up and use it for attaboys, which is what continuous feedback apps were built for. They were built to kind of increase morale around positive encouragement, but they're not going to provide the hard truths. They're not going to like really, or they'll use it vindictively, right? Someone might go in and gotcha. But usually those continuous apps aren't anonymous in quite that way. And someone's going to know if you do anything really nasty, but they tend to be more for attaboys. People don't want to provide critical feedback. The other key issue, and I'm kind of summarizing the piece in my chapter, but I recommend you look at it. I was pretty thorough and kind of unpacking the pros and cons. But the biggest issue I think is in a leadership survey that's comprehensive, you've got a view of a person from their all the different dimensions of leadership in your model, or if it's an off-the-shelf model. But in a continuous feedback app, it's like what we know. We've done some research on open-ended comments. Even they tend to be very narrow. So, for example, it's like 0.4% of comments are around integrity issues, but they may be very important items that are overlooked. So people just don't naturally talk about many different subjects in open-ended, clear, continuous feedback. So you end up overlooking a bunch of really important leadership attributes when you rely on the continuous feedback approach. It could be used, I would say, if I'm going to be, balanced, you could use it as, okay, I've done my 360. I'm working on, think about that delegation, that woman working on delegation. I'm working on delegation. Let me ping people and ask for feedback about my delegation. So in that context, I think they could be very useful. But in the context of, but even then, it's unclear that you're going to get real critical feedback. The data suggests that people just don't tend to be critical. Um, so, I think it could be used for that, but I would not rely on it for really leveling up your leadership in a meaningful way.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Thank you again for joining us today. If you want to talk about how feedback can support your talent goals, please reach out to us and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.